Before we start this lesson, there's a worksheet for this lesson that you should have before you start. Throughout this lesson, I'm going to give you some questions to solve that are printed on the worksheet, so when you see a section of the worksheet on screen, you can go ahead and do it on the worksheet. Everything is in order, so the first problem on the sheet where you're going to circle an image is going to be the first one on screen, and the second problem, which will be matching pieces and letters, will be second, and so on. Make sure to give everything your best shot, and this is very important. If you get something wrong, just cross it out and write the correct answer, which will be on the screen. So that way, if you forget or are unsure about anything, you can flip back to the problems and have a cheat sheet or an example to go off of. Also, this lesson is a bit longer than the other lessons I've done, so there's not a whole lot of time to get the correct answers written down. So make sure that right away when I give you the answer to a problem, you are checking your answers to make sure you get the right thing and correcting yourself if you got it wrong. If you miss some of the correct answers, once you're done with the whole video, you can also come back to each individual part and look at the answers again to make sure you have everything written down correctly. Anyways, enjoy the video. Hey everyone, welcome to today's video. Today we're going to talk about notation. So first, what is notation? Well, notation is just a method that we use to record what happens in our games. Chess is a very old game, so in the past, chess players weren't able to use a phone to take a video of a game, or play on a website that stores your games for you, meaning if you wanted to see a past game of yours, you wouldn't be able to. And this is why notation exists. It provides a fast, easy way to write everything down during your games, so that later, when you want to see them again, you can just look at your notation and replay the game. So first things first, let's take a look at the notation sheet. Here I have an example from chess.com, and this is what we're actually going to be putting our moves onto. And different sheets might look a little bit different, but they're all pretty much the same thing. So let's break down the different parts of the sheet. First off, the stuff at the top, up here, isn't really that important, unless you want to have a specific log of events you played at and people you played against, but we don't need that, so we're just going to ignore it. This part below it, however, is the stuff we actually need. These two tables here. And these tables are where we're going to actually be putting down our notation. So the way this works is we have white's first move in this cell here. And then after white makes their first move, black will make their first move. And it'll be black's first move in the cell here, right? And then after black's first move, white will make their second move. So have white's second move will be in this cell here, right? And this pattern is going to continue all the way down to the end of the table. And now once you get to the end of the table, then you can move back up to this next table and start at the top. And you'll notice these numbers go 1, 2, 3, 4, all the way down to 25 here. And then after 25 would be 26. So we just have to find 26, which is at the top of the next table. So we know that after we're done with this first table, we just move to the top of the next one. And we just continue the pattern there. White's 26th move will be in this cell. And black's, it's a bad circle, black's 26th move will be in this cell here. And then once you get down, or if you get down, because you might not, your game might not be that long, if you get down to this last row here, notice there's no more tables for you to go to on the right here, and you also can't go down any further. So in this situation, you could either get a new notation sheet and start notating on that, or you could flip your notation sheet over and it's probably just going to be a blank like printer paper on the back, and then you can make a table like this and continue notating there. So before we move on, here's a quick quiz to make sure you have everything down. On the screen I have a few notation sheets, but only one of them is filled out correctly, and it's your job to figure out which one is right. Your time starts now. Alright everyone, the answer to this question is this sheet here. Remember, we know which cell we should be putting our moves in from the number on the side. So white and black's first moves should be in row 1, and their second in row 2, and their third in row 3, and then so on down the table. So now we know how to properly fill out the notation sheet, but what exactly is going on the sheet? Well, if we try to write out every move we played with words, it would take forever. Imagine having to write out something as long as queen captures on f7 checkmate every single move. It would take forever. For this reason, there's a system we use full of numbers and symbols that we can write down instead, and with each number and symbol representing a different piece or action. Let's start with the pieces. Each piece has an assigned letter, and when you move that piece, you would notate the move using that piece's letter. To keep things easy, the letter given to each piece is based on their names. For example, the knight's assigned letter is N because knight begins with an N sound. The rest of them are B for the bishop, R for the rook, Q for the queen, K for the king, and the pawn is special because pawns don't get a letter. The only time pawns need to be given a letter is when they capture something. So if that happens, you would use the letter for the column that it's on. Let's take a look at an example here. Let's say that white's pawn here captures this pawn on f5, right? Let's go back. White's pawn right now is on the E column, and we can tell that it's on the E column, but because of this little E at the bottom of the board here. So in this situation, the pawn would take the letter E. If the pawns were over here instead, and our white pawn is capturing here, now our pawn is in the B column. So now it would take the letter B. All of the letters that we use to denote all of the pieces are uppercase, with the exception of the pawn, which is lowercase. And you'll see throughout this lesson that every time a letter appears that refers to the columns on the board, it'll be lowercase. So that way there isn't any confusion between the pieces and the squares on the board. That was probably a lot, so let's review before we move on. For this next part, match the piece to its assigned letter. Your time starts now. Alright, good work everyone. Here are the correct answers. If you're ever confused, just remember that each piece's letter is based on their name, except for the pawn, which takes the letter of its column. Okay, next up are the actions, and these are going to be a little bit more difficult. Unlike the pieces, the symbols that each action is given aren't going to match their names, so you'll unfortunately have to memorize them. That being said, here they are. When we capture a piece, we use an X. When we give a check, we use a plus. When we give checkmate, we either use 2 pluses or a hashtag, with the hashtag being the more popular option. When we promote a pawn, we use the equal sign, followed by the letter of the piece we are promoting into. Usually, we promote into a queen, since the queen is the best piece, so it'll be equals queen. But if you promote into a knight, for example, you'd write equals n instead. Lastly, we have castling, which is a bit more complicated. When you castle, you can either move your king to the king side, in kingside castle, which is this one here, or you can move it to the queen side in the queenside castle, which is this one. I'm trying not to make it too complicated, but when you castle kingside, your rook moves a total of 2 squares. So it starts on this h1 square, we're moving king over, rook comes over, and it goes 1, 2 squares. When you castle queenside, your rook moves 3 squares. So it comes over, 1, 2, 3. We also call king and queenside castling short and long castling because the rook moves a shorter distance in the kingside castle and a longer distance in the queenside castle. And I'm going to be using the terms short and long castling for the rest of the video because it's just easier than saying king queenside castling. But the reason I bring this up is because the notation for long and short castling are different. For a short castle, we use 2 O's with a dash between them, and for a long castle, we use 3 O's with dashes in between. If you need a trick to memorize them, the amount of O's in the notation is the same as the number of squares the rook moves. Remember, in a kingside castle, the rook moves a total of 2 squares, and in a queenside castle, the rook is moving 3 squares. Before we move on, let's do some more matching. These might be pretty tough, but just try your best. Good work to everyone, and here are the correct answers. Even if you didn't get any of them right, don't sweat it. You can always come back and take a look at the sheet again if you forget. Okay, the last part to go over are the squares. Each square is represented by a letter and number, which you can see if you look on the edges of the board. Some boards might not have these letters and numbers, so you'll eventually have to memorize them, but that comes naturally with time, so don't worry about that too much. Anyhow, the name of each square is the letter column it's on, followed by the number row it's on. For example, I'm going to highlight a square here. This square is on the column D and the row 6. So the name of this square is D6. And remember, to make it easy to differentiate between the pieces and the squares, the D in this case is going to be lowercase because it's the name of the column in the square. Alright, time for another question. This time, you have 2 boards with 1 piece on them. For each board, I want you to write the name of the square that piece is on. Don't worry about the name of the piece, I just want the name of the square. Looking at the numbers and letters can be confusing, but again, just try your best. Time's up, here are the answers. If you feel like this is really difficult, then don't worry. When I started, I felt that way too. It might take a bit, but you'll eventually be able to map out the board in your head and tell where a square is without even looking at the numbers and letters on the board. Okay, so before we move on, I just want to say good work to everybody, because you've done all the hard stuff. This next part is just going to be combining the parts we've already done and actually putting them onto the notation sheet. So let's get started. So when we put stuff on the notation sheet, we use a specific order so that everyone can read everyone else's notation. The first thing we write down is the name of the piece. So I'm going to put a queen on the board here, and we're going to move this queen. Remember, the queen is a Q, so if I was going to move this queen, I would write Q. After that, if anything got captured, we write that notation, which is an X. Nothing is going to get captured here when I move this queen because there's no other pieces on the board, so we're just not going to write anything. After that, we write the square the piece moved to. I'm going to make our queen go to, let's say D5. I'm going to make it go here, right? So it moved to the D5 square. So after the Q, I would write D5. Then we have to check. Is our queen giving check, or is it checkmating the other king? In this situation, there's no kings on the board for the queen to check or checkmate, so just like what we did for the capture, we're just not going to write anything. And that's going to be the final notation for this move right here. This is going to be queen to D5. I'm going to go over 5 examples with you, and then you'll have some more to do on your own. First up is knight moves to h5, which is this move here. So first off, the piece we're moving is the knight. So knight is n, written n. So this knight is going to h5. We know it's going to h5 because it's on the h column, as you can see, there's h here, and row 5, as you can see, there's 5 here. So after the n, we have to check, is it capturing anything? And it didn't, so we're not going to write the x. After the x is going to be the square. So h5 is the square, so we'd write h5. And now we have to see, is the knight giving check? Is it giving checkmate? And in this situation, there is no king to check or give checkmate to. So we wouldn't write the notation for those. So our final notation for this is nh5, or knight goes to h5. So next up, we have pawn to e3, which is this move here. Now remember, pawns don't have their own letter. They take the letter of the column that they're on. But that only applies when the pawn is capturing something. So in this move here, pawn to e3, the pawn didn't capture anything, so it's just not going to have a letter there. So remember that previous example with knights to h5, we had the name here. With the pawn move, we're just going to get rid of that, right? We don't need that part of the notation. So we're going to skip that name, we're going to skip the capture notation because nothing was captured, and we're just going to write the square that the pawn moved to, which in this case is going to be e3. So our final notation for this move is actually just e3. So whenever you see something like this, where it doesn't tell you what piece moved, you can just assume that a pawn moved there. Okay, next one is queen moves to a1 with checkmate, which is this move. Now, there's lots to do here, so let's take it step by step. First off, the queen moved, which means right off the bat we have a q. Now we need to check, did the queen capture anything? Well, there's nothing here, so there's going to be no x. Now, the queen moved to the a1 square, so we're going to write a1. But we also have to check, is it giving check? Is it giving checkmate? And in this situation, it's not giving check. The queen is giving checkmate. So we'd write the hashtag, or you could alternatively write this with the double plus, right? And both of these are correct. And this is going to be our final notation. Queen goes to a1 with checkmate. Okay, next up, we have pawn captures c5 with check, which is this move right here. Now, let's go back a second. Remember from earlier, pawns, if they're capturing something, take the name of the column that they're on. So this pawn right now is on the B column, as you can see here with the B, right? So the first thing we do is write the B. But remember, this is going to be lowercase b, because it's the name of the column, not the piece. So we have B, and because it's capturing something here, we would write X, right? After the X, we have to write the name of the square the piece is moving to, right? So in this case, this is C5. So we write C5. And now we have to check, is the pawn giving check? Is it checkmating? In this situation, the pawn is giving check, so we'd write a plus. And that would be our final notation, bx c5 plus, or the b file pawn is capturing on c5 with a check. Okay, last one. We have short castle with check, which is this move here. Now, castling is notated a little bit differently. Let's say, for example, let's take the one we did, queen moves to a1 with checkmate. You can see the different parts here. There's the queen, the name of the piece, and the square it moves to, and then what happens, right? This is going to be a little bit different, because with the castling, we actually just get rid of all of this, right? And instead of writing the name and the square the piece is moving to, since we're moving two pieces, we can't do that. So instead, we would just write our O-O. Remember, this is the short castle where the rook moves two squares, so we have two O's, right? And then after that, we would check, is the rook giving check? Is the rook giving checkmate, right? And in this situation, it's giving check. So we write the plus here, right? And we don't have to worry about capturing because you can't capture with a castle. And that's going to be our final notation. It's going to be O-O plus, or short castle with check. Okay, now I'm going to give you some time to think and do these ones on your own. They'll be pretty similar to what we just did, but they won't be exactly the same. Anyways, good luck, and your time starts now. Alright everyone, here are the answers. This first move is knight captures e6, or this move here. So first off, we have a knight, which is n, so we can write that down. And the knight captured something, so we can write x. So now the knight moved to the e6 square, we can tell because it's on the e column and the 6th row, so we can write e6. And that is going to be our final notation because this knight isn't checking or giving checkmate. So our final notation is nx e6, or knight captured on e6. Okay, next move is queen to h3, which is this move. So we have our queen, which is q. It's not capturing anything, so we don't need the x. And it's moving to the h3 square. So we write h3. And it's not giving check, we're not checkmating, so we don't need the plus of the hashtag. And this is our final notation. Queen q h3, or queen goes to h3. The next move is rook captures h5 with checkmate, which is this move. So first we have our rook, r, that is capturing something, so x. It's moving to the h5 square. So h5. And we're giving checkmate. So checkmate is the hashtag. Or you could write this rx h5 and then plus plus instead of the hashtag. And this will be our final notation. The rook is capturing on h5 with checkmate. Okay, last one is long castle, which is this move here, right? So remember, with the long castle, the rook is moving 3 squares, 1, 2, and 3. So we need 3 O's. So it'll be O dash O dash O. And then we need to check. Once we make the move, are there any checks if they're checkmate? And there isn't. So this is our final notation, O dash O dash O, or long castle. Now that you know how the notation sheet works and how to actually take notation, you should be able to put these two things together and write down your notation in the notation sheet. And I'm just going to go over that really quickly, just give an example of what something might look like. So an example game might be e4, e5, knight f3, knight c6, say bishop c5, and you get the idea. It's going to look like this. And because I know how to take notation, I know that what I just notated was e4, e5, knight f3, knight c6, bishop c5. From reading that notation sheet, I can figure out what happened, and I can replay that on the board. If you want more practice, or maybe you didn't get some of these right, you can actually go online and play games on sites like ChessKid, Chess.com, or Lichess, and they'll usually have a box on the side that tells you the notation for each move as you play them. So you can take notation by yourself on a sheet of paper and then compare it after the game is over to the notation that the computer made, so you can see what you're getting right and what you're getting wrong. Most notation is going to look like what we just did, but there are some special cases where we have to add in an extra letter or number. So let's take a look at an example real quick to see what I'm talking about. In this position, we have a rook on b4 and a rook on g4. If we move our b4 rook to e4, which is this move here, the notation would be rook goes to e4. But let's move this rook back, and let's pretend maybe it's a month later, and we're trying to read the notation sheet and figure out what happened. And we see rook e4. Now, both of these rooks can actually move to e4. So when we see rook e4, we don't know which rook we're talking about. So we're not able to play the game back properly. And because of this, we need to add another letter or number to show which piece is being talked about. And in this case, the rooks are on the same row, the row 4. So we're going to use the letter of the columns they're on to show which piece we're talking about. So we know that the rook on the B file moved to the e4 square. So to show this, we're going, instead of saying rook e4, we're going to say rook B e4, right? Because it was on the B file. And we can't say rook 4 e4 because both of these rooks are on the 4th row. So it wouldn't change anything. We still don't know which rook we're talking about. But by writing down the column of the rook that moved, we can actually show that it was the B rook that moved, not the G rook. And this would be the correct notation for it. Alternatively, you could have something like this, where there's a rook on D2 and there is a rook on D7, right? And let's say that we have the move rook to D5, which is this one. Right. Now, if we just wrote down rook to d5, then both of these rooks can move to d5, so we wouldn't know that it's actually this move, or this rook that's moving. So we need to take the letter of the column. But in this case, the rooks are both on the D column, the D file, right? So we can't write rook d d5, because that doesn't tell us anything. It's the same thing as here. So in this case, we would use the row the rook is on. So in this case, there's a rook on the row 7 and row 2. We're moving this rook here, that's on row 2. So we would write 2 d5. The rook on row 2 is moving to d5 here. So for those examples, I used rooks because rooks often end up on the same rows and files and end up in that situation where you need to differentiate between them, because it's just a good strategy to have your rooks on the same file and column. But this issue can also happen to other pieces. On the board, I have 2 knights that can both move to the d4 square. So if I want to say this knight on the bottom is moving to the d4 square, then I have to write n for knight, e, because it's on the E column here, d4. The knight on the E column is moving to d4. And you could also write n2 d4, because it's on the second row, and these knights aren't on the same row as each other. But usually you'll see ne d4 over n2 d4, because we usually use the column the piece is on if it's a situation like this and they're not on the same row or column. But anyways, that's all for this lesson, and I'll see you in the next video.